On the day he became a legend, 3 of the strongest clans in the tower sent envoys just to speak his name out loud. Rankers who had spent a decade climbing floors bowed their heads when he walked past. Gods, actual gods, were said to know him by title before they knew his face. Nobody in that future crowd remembered that he once entered the tower with nothing but a soldier's discipline and a dead man's watch in his pocket. None of them knew where it started. It started with a phone call that Che Yun-woo almost didn't answer. He was cleaning his rifle when his phone rang, 3 weeks after his discharge papers came through. The number belonged to a hospital he didn't recognize. A tired voice on the other end asked if he was the older brother of a man named Min. Yun-woo said yes before the woman finished the sentence, because some part of him already understood what was coming. His brother was dead. Found in an alley behind a shuttered building downtown, no wounds, no explanation, just a body that looked like it had aged 20 years overnight. The coroner couldn't explain the calluses on his hands, thick and strange, like a man who had spent years gripping a sword instead of a keyboard. Min had been a university student. He had never held a weapon in his life. Yun-woo stood in that hospital hallway for a long time. He didn't cry. Crying was something he had trained himself out of, back in basic, back when tears meant weakness in front of men who were counting on him. Instead, he asked to see the body, and the nurse hesitated before letting him in. His brother's face looked peaceful. His hands did not. Scarred knuckles, a burn mark along one forearm shaped almost like a claw, and a ring on his smallest finger that Yun-woo had never seen before. When he picked up the small box of Min's belongings from the front desk, an old pocket watch slid out from underneath a folded shirt. It was heavier than it looked, warm even though it had been sitting in a cold storage locker for 2 days. He almost left it behind. He didn't know that decision would change the rest of his life. 3 days later, at his mother's apartment, Yun-woo sat on the edge of Min's old bed and turned the watch over in his hands. His mother was asleep down the hall, worn thin by a sickness the doctors kept calling rare instead of naming properly. Min had always sworn he would find her medicine somewhere, some clinic, some trial, something. He never explained where. He had simply vanished for almost 2 years, sending short messages that grew stranger every month, and then he stopped sending anything at all. Yun-woo pressed his thumb against the watch's crystal face without meaning to. The second hand didn't move. Instead, the glass rippled, like water disturbed by a dropped stone, and a soft blue light spilled out across his palm. He should have dropped it. He didn't. The light pulled him somewhere else entirely, a place with gray stone walls stretching higher than any building he had ever stood beneath, air that smelled faintly of ash and old rain. A voice spoke inside his skull, calm and mechanical, welcoming him as an inheritor. It called him the older brother of a registered tower participant. It asked if he wished to accept a bequest. He didn't understand the question. He said yes anyway. What followed wasn't a dream. Memories poured into him, not his own, arranged in fragments that snapped together the way a shattered plate reassembles itself if you throw the pieces hard enough into the right order. He saw his brother, thinner than in the photos, standing in front of towering stone doors with a group of strangers he didn't recognize. He heard Min's voice, older sounding, harder, explaining to someone that he had entered the tower for one reason only. A rumor of a medicine that could cure diseases doctors on the outside called incurable. The memories jumped forward. Min in combat, blade in hand, movements clumsy but improving fast. Faster than should have been possible for someone who used to trip over gym equipment. Min forming a party. 4 other faces, one of them a woman with sharp eyes and a softer smile who looked at him like he mattered. Yun-woo watched his brother fall in love with a stranger inside a nightmare built of stone and monsters, and some helpless part of him wanted to reach through the memory and warn him. The memories kept coming, faster now, less patient. A war between rival clans over control of a floor. Min's group caught in the middle, promised protection by an ally who turned out to answer to someone else entirely. A battle in a collapsing hall. Min bleeding from a wound that shouldn't have been fatal, calling out a name, the name of the woman with sharp eyes. She was the one who put the blade through him. Yun-woo felt the memory as if it were his own chest being opened. No warning, no argument, just her hand closing around a dagger's hilt and driving it home, while Min looked at her with an expression that had no room left for surprise, only a terrible, quiet understanding. Somewhere behind her, other figures watched and did nothing. One of them had shared meals with Min for months. One of them had sworn an oath of loyalty in front of witnesses only weeks before. Everyone he trusted had known. Somehow, everyone had known, and no one had warned him. The final memory was the quietest. Min, alone, propped against a broken pillar, recording a message on a device Yun-woo somehow understood was linked to this very watch. His brother's voice, thin and steady despite everything, apologized for failing to bring the medicine home. He apologized for leaving their mother waiting. He said her name once, softly, and then he said his brother's name, and told him that if this recording ever reached him, it meant the tower had taken more from their family than it had any right to take. The recording ended. The blue light faded. Yun-woo was back on the edge of the bed, the watch cold in his hand, his own face wet in a way he hadn't allowed in years. He didn't sleep that night. He sat with the watch until morning, running through his brother's final words on a loop that his own mind wouldn't let go of, and by the time the sun came up he had already made a decision that no longer felt like a choice. He was going to find that tower. He was going to find every person who watched his brother die and did nothing, every person who could have stopped a blade and chose not to, and he was going to make each of them understand exactly what they had thrown away. He didn't know yet how literal that last part would become. Getting into the tower wasn't difficult, not for someone who had already inherited a tower participant's registration through blood. A second pulse of light took him from his mother's apartment straight into a waiting hall built from the same gray stone he had seen in the memories, crowded with a few dozen other newcomers, all of them wearing the same dazed expression he assumed he was wearing too. A voice, calm and without gender, announced the beginning of the tutorial. 7 blocks, it said, lettered from A through G. Survival was not guaranteed. Rewards would scale with performance. Names would be recorded. Rankings would be public. Yun-woo barely listened to the rules. He was doing something else, something the mechanical voice hadn't accounted for. He was testing the edges of what his brother's memory had left behind inside him, a strange second layer of awareness sitting just behind his own thoughts. When he focused on a stranger nearby, faint numbers flickered into view along the edge of his vision, small glowing readouts naming the man's strength and stamina like a soldier's dossier. Dragon Eyes, some instinct told him, though nobody had explained the name to him. It simply arrived, the way his brother's memories had arrived, a gift stitched into whatever the watch had done to him. He kept it to himself. The other newcomers were already sizing each other up, some with open hostility, some with barely hidden fear. Yun-woo had spent enough years in uniforms full of men who postured before a fight to know exactly how dangerous open confidence could be, and how useful quiet observation was instead. The first trial dropped them into a corridor lined with pressure plates and swinging blades, an obstacle course dressed up as a survival test. 2 people died in the first 10 minutes. Careless steps, bad timing, screams cut short by stone closing over them like a mouth. Yun-woo moved through it the way he had once moved through live fire drills, counting his steps, reading the rhythm of the traps before committing his weight, letting his old training carry him where his new abilities hadn't caught up yet. He crossed the corridor in under 4 minutes. Only 6 others made it through in similar time. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with the calm eyes of someone who had already accepted he might die today, nodded at him once before moving on without a word. Yun-woo filed the face away without a name attached to it yet. By the second stage, something else became clear. The tower rewarded more than survival. It rewarded thoroughness, hidden paths, small unnoticed choices that most competitors rushed past without a second glance. A side chamber tucked behind a false wall held nothing but a dusty ticket and a short description that made Yun-woo stop walking entirely. A reset ticket. Return to any previous checkpoint of your choosing. Cost. A permanent reduction of 1 stat point. Most players would never use something like that voluntarily. Losing a stat point was losing power forever, a price nobody sane paid on purpose. Yun-woo turned the ticket over in his fingers and thought about his brother clawing his way through this same building with nothing but desperation and a stranger's love that eventually killed him. He thought about how much faster Min might have grown if someone had told him the rules could be broken this way. Yun-woo picked up every ticket he found after that, and he began using them the moment he understood the deeper trick behind them. A stat lost from one attribute could be earned back many times over if the run afterward went better, faster, cleaner. He wasn't gambling power away. He was investing it, the same cold calculation he had once used to plan an ambush, applied now to grinding through a stage that other players treated as a single, unrepeatable event. He ran the second trial 4 times. Each time he shaved seconds off his path, learned which pressure plates reset and which stayed armed, learned exactly when a swinging blade's arc left a gap wide enough to slip through untouched. By the 4th run, his numbers had climbed past anyone else who had entered that day, and nobody watching the rankings understood how a masked newcomer with no visible reputation had suddenly outpaced players who had been grinding since morning. He kept the mask on the whole time, a simple cloth wrap he'd found discarded near the first checkpoint, more habit than plan at first. By the 3rd stage, it had become deliberate. He didn't want his name climbing any boards yet. He didn't want the people who had killed his brother to have any warning at all before he found them. The 3rd stage introduced him to Ule. She was pinned against a cracked wall when he found her. 3 other tutorial players circling with the loose, cruel confidence of people who had already decided the outcome. Ule was younger than the rest, thin, her hands trembling not from fear alone but from exhaustion. Mana burned down to nothing after what looked like an hour of running. One of the men circling her was laughing about something, the kind of laugh that made Yunwoo's jaw tighten before he even understood the joke. He recognized the shape of it immediately. Trusted companions, isolating someone weaker, waiting for the moment she had nothing left to fight back with. He had watched exactly this pattern unfold inside his brother's memories. Different faces, same appetite. He didn't announce himself. He simply walked into the middle of it, and by the time the first man turned to demand who he thought he was, Yunwoo had already closed the distance and put him on the ground with a strike that used none of his new abilities at all. Just old muscle memory from a life that used to involve much worse than tutorial bullies. The other 2 hesitated exactly as long as it took to realize the newcomer wasn't posturing. Then they ran. Ule stared at him from the ground for a long moment before she managed to speak. And what she said first wasn't thank you. She asked why he had bothered. Yunwoo didn't have a clean answer for that, not one he wanted to say out loud. He helped her up instead and told her to keep her guard higher next time, and when she flinched at even that gentle a correction, something in him softened despite everything he had promised himself about staying detached. She reminded him too much of someone else who had once trusted the wrong people and paid for it. Ule turned out to be a scholar type, more comfortable analyzing a spell than casting one, the kind of player the tower chewed up quickly if nobody stood between her and the wrong crowd. She had entered searching for tuition money, not glory, a detail she admitted almost apologetically, as if wanting to survive for something ordinary was somehow less noble than wanting to survive for revenge. Yunwoo didn't correct her. He simply let her talk while they walked, and in exchange she taught him the basics of reading mana signatures, a skill she clearly assumed he already half understood given how easily he picked it up. She had no idea the dragon eyes sitting behind his own vision were doing most of the work for him. He let her believe her teaching mattered, because it did, just not in the way she thought. They cleared the 4th stage together, a maze that punished players for backtracking by quietly shifting the walls behind them. Ule's ability to sense subtle shifts in ambient magic kept them from wasting hours doubling back through dead ends, and Yunwoo's habit of counting paces kept them oriented even when the corridors twisted at angles that shouldn't have been geometrically possible. By the time they reached the exit, 3 separate groups were still lost somewhere behind them, and one of the men who had cornered Ule earlier limped past the checkpoint looking considerably less confident than before. The 5th stage was where Yunwoo first heard the name Khan spoken with any real weight behind it. A cluster of tutorial players had gathered near the checkpoint entrance, most of them watching one board in particular, a public leaderboard tracking clear times and combat scores across every group still active. Khan's name had sat near the top since the 2nd stage, alongside a partner named Doyle whose combat style apparently involved summoned insects large enough to unsettle grown men twice his size. Yunwoo's own name wasn't on that board yet. He had made sure of it, routing around every checkpoint that logged a public score whenever the option existed, accepting slightly harder paths in exchange for staying invisible. Some part of him understood this made him look weaker than he actually was to anyone watching, and he decided that was exactly the impression he wanted to leave. He met Khan properly in the 6th stage, in a chamber built around a single locked vault door that apparently required 3 separate parties to open simultaneously, a design meant to force cooperation between strangers who would otherwise never work together. Khan was broad through the shoulders, calm in a way that reminded Yunwoo faintly of veteran soldiers who had stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. Doyle stood beside him, younger, quicker to speak, with a nervous energy that seemed to calm the moment actual danger appeared. Khan studied Yunwoo for a long moment before speaking, the kind of look a man gives another man he's trying to measure, without insulting him by asking outright. He asked, simply, whether the masked stranger intended to help open the vault or intended to take whatever sat behind it once someone else did the work. Yunwoo told him he intended to help, and meant it, mostly because refusing would have cost him more attention than cooperating would. The vault took the combined effort of Yunwoo's group, Khan's group, and a third party led by a sharp-eyed woman named Adora, who spent most of the encounter watching Yunwoo instead of the vault mechanism itself. She asked no questions. She simply observed the way he moved, the way he read the vault's pressure sequence half a step before anyone explained it out loud, and something in her expression shifted from professional curiosity into something closer to genuine interest by the time the door finally ground open. Inside waited a modest hall, split fairly between the three groups by mutual unspoken agreement, along with a deeper passage none of the tutorial notices had mentioned. Most players would have taken their share and moved on toward the next marked checkpoint. Yunwoo lingered at the mouth of that hidden passage instead, and Ule, watching him, asked if he was seriously considering walking into an unmarked corridor when the marked path was sitting right there waiting. He told her some of the best things in this place probably weren't sitting on marked paths at all. He didn't tell her that this instinct had come from his brother's memories, fragments of a man who had once ignored an unmarked door and found nothing, and another time ignored a different unmarked door and found the very artifact that had kept him alive for another 6 months longer than he otherwise would have survived. The passage led to a hidden dungeon, small by tower standards but dense with danger, thick vines coiled with faint mana, insects the size of dogs skittering along the ceiling, air that smelled like wet iron. Ule wanted to turn back within the first 100 feet. Yunwoo kept moving, and after a moment's hesitation, she followed rather than face the corridor alone. They found the centipede 3 chambers deeper, a creature nearly the length of a delivery truck, its carapace glinting with a sickly violet sheen that Yunwoo's dragon eyes flagged immediately as unusually dense, armor thick enough to shrug off anything less than a dedicated strike. It came at them fast for something so large, faster than Ule's scream had time to finish leaving her throat. Yunwoo didn't fight it head-on. He'd learned enough from the earlier stages, and from fragments of memory that weren't originally his, to know that raw strength rarely won fights in this place. Positioning did. He drew the creature into a narrower stretch of the corridor where its size worked against it, let it commit to a lunge it couldn't fully redirect, and put every ounce of momentum he had into a strike aimed exactly where his vision told him the shell was thinnest. The blade went through. The creature thrashed once, twice, and then went still in a way that left the whole tunnel eerily quiet except for Ule's ragged breathing. His body changed after that kill, subtly at first, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with exertion. Some instinct whispered that consuming part of a creature this dense could accelerate whatever evolution his body had already begun undergoing since the watch first opened. He didn't explain any of this to Ule. He simply noted it, filed it away the same careful way he filed away every other advantage this place offered people willing to look past the obvious path. Deeper in the dungeon, past a chamber littered with the husks of smaller insects, they found the dagger. It sat inside a cracked stone pedestal, wrapped in vines that pulled away the moment Yunwoo's hand came close, as though the plant itself recognized something in him worth deferring to. The blade looked unremarkable at first glance. Dark metal, a hilt wrapped in cracked leather, nothing like the glowing legendary weapons some players whispered about on the boards. His dragon eyes told a different story, flickering with a faint, layered symbol he didn't fully understand yet, a marking that suggested the weapon's true nature was sealed rather than absent. He took it anyway. He would learn what it truly was later, in blood, the same way he seemed to be learning everything else in this place. Ula stared at the empty pedestal after he'd pocketed the blade, then looked at him with an expression somewhere between awe and unease. She asked quietly, exactly what he was, someone who moved through danger like he'd already lived through it once before. Yunwoo didn't answer that directly. He only told her that he'd had a good teacher, once, and left it there, watching her decide not to push further. They cleared the remaining stages side by side, though he never let the alliance calcify into anything permanent. Khan asked twice more, in increasingly direct terms, whether Yunwoo would consider joining his group properly once the tutorial ended. Doyle backed the offer with a kind of earnest enthusiasm that made refusing almost feel rude. Yunwoo deflected both times, polite but firm, and something in Khan's expression suggested the man understood exactly why a stranger with no visible past might want to keep every door open rather than commit to one. By the time the 7th block arrived, the true ranking battle, Yunwoo's numbers sat far higher than anyone realized, buried beneath a mask and a name he had never once spoken aloud on a public board. The strongest remaining players expected an easy field, a handful of known threats and a crowd of forgettable stragglers. Nobody had accounted for the quiet stranger who had spent the entire tutorial hiding exactly how far he'd already come. The arena for the final battle was a circular pit carved from black stone, tiered seating rising on all sides, though no living audience filled it, only floating orbs of light that recorded everything for the tower's administrators. 62 players remained out of the hundreds who had entered the tutorial. Only the top 8 would advance with the full weight of first-place rewards. Fonte's name was called first, and the crowd of remaining competitors actually went quiet at the sound of it. Yunwoo had heard whispers about him throughout the 7th block, a fighter who treated every match like a private celebration, grinning through wounds that would have dropped weaker opponents twice over. Fonte fought like a man who genuinely enjoyed pain, both giving it and receiving it, and his opening match ended in under 90 seconds with his opponent unconscious against the pit wall. Yunwoo's own name got called an hour later, still muffled behind a designation the announcer clearly struggled to pronounce, a placeholder tag assigned to players who had never registered publicly. His opponent was a woman with twin short swords and a reputation for speed, someone who had cleared 4 of the 7 blocks without a single recorded loss. She came at him fast, exactly as advertised, twin blades weaving patterns meant to overwhelm through sheer number of angles rather than any single devastating strike. Yunwoo let his dragon eyes do what they'd been doing all tutorial, mapping the rhythm behind her speed, rather than trying to match it outright. She was fast, but predictable, in a way she probably didn't realize herself, favoring her right side whenever she committed to a combination longer than 3 strikes. He waited through the 4th exchange, absorbed a shallow cut along his forearm that would heal within the hour, and on the 5th exchange, stepped inside her guard instead of retreating from it. The dagger found her wrist before she finished her next swing, forcing her sword loose, and the fight ended less than a second later with the flat of his blade against her throat. The crowd murmured. Somewhere in that ripple of surprised whispers, a name started circulating that hadn't existed on any leaderboard until that exact moment, attached now to a masked figure nobody could place. Adora watched that match from the tiered seating with an expression Doyle later described as unreadable, though Khan seemed to read it just fine, nudging his partner and muttering something about a woman who'd clearly already decided something important about the fight she'd just witnessed. Yunwoo noticed her watching. He filed it away with everything else, another detail that mattered but didn't yet demand his attention. His second match came against a heavy-set brawler who relied on brute force over technique, someone who had bulldozed through 3 previous opponents by simply refusing to stop advancing regardless of damage taken. Yunwoo used the reach of his dagger and the lessons of 100 close-quarters drills to keep the man at range long enough to wear down his stamina, then closed the distance the instant his opponent's guard dropped from exhaustion rather than injury. It wasn't glamorous. It was efficient, and efficiency was worth more than spectacle to a man who had spent years being told that showmanship got soldiers killed. By his 3rd match, whispers about the masked competitor had turned into open conversation among the remaining players. Someone claimed he'd beaten every opponent using techniques nobody recognized. Someone else insisted he had to be a former ranker hiding his identity to dodge some old rivalry. Nobody guessed the truth, that a soldier with no tower experience at all had simply inherited enough knowledge and instinct from a dead man's memories to outthink competitors who had been training inside these walls for months. His 3rd opponent was Doyle. Neither of them wanted the match, exactly. Doyle approached the center of the pit with an apologetic half-smile, admitting he'd hoped they wouldn't be paired against each other this early, given how much Khan valued the connection. Yunwoo told him this wasn't personal, and meant it, though some old instinct reminded him that battlefield fairness rarely mattered once the fighting actually started. Doyle's summoned insects came at him from 3 directions at once, a swarm coordinated with more precision than their small size suggested. Yunwoo had watched this fighting style from a distance throughout the tutorial without ever facing it directly, and for the first several exchanges he found himself genuinely tested, forced to burn through options faster than any previous match had required. A stinger grazed his shoulder. Another nearly caught his exposed neck before he twisted clear at the last possible instant. He won by recognizing something Doyle himself likely hadn't fully considered, that every swarm needed a central point of coordination, and that point sat inside Doyle's own concentration rather than in any single insect. Yunwoo closed the distance directly, ignored 2 more stings that would leave bruises for days, and put his blade at Doyle's throat before the younger man could redirect his focus. Doyle laughed once the match ended, more relieved than upset, and told him honestly that he was glad Khan hadn't drawn this particular matchup, because Khan wouldn't have gone easy on the insects the way Yunwoo apparently had. Yunwoo didn't correct the assumption that he'd been holding back out of mercy rather than efficiency. Some misunderstandings were useful to leave uncorrected. The semifinal brought him face to face with Fonte. The crowd's energy shifted the moment both names were announced together, a genuine buzz replacing the earlier murmurs, because everyone watching understood this was the match that would define the entire tutorial's ranking. Fonte grinned at him across the pit, the expression of a man who had been waiting the whole tournament for a fight that might actually challenge him. He asked, almost cheerfully, whether the mask hid a face Fonte should already recognize from some other floor. Yunwoo told him it hid nothing worth knowing yet, and Fonte laughed at that, apparently satisfied with the answer, regardless of what it actually meant. Their fight opened faster and harder than any previous match that day. Fonte fought without hesitation, throwing his full weight into every strike, absorbing damage that would have staggered lesser opponents, and using the resulting momentum to push even harder. Yunwoo's arms ached within the first 30 seconds from blocking blows that landed like falling masonry. His years of combat training kept him alive through the opening exchange, but training alone wasn't going to win this fight outright. He needed the dagger's true nature, whatever it actually was. He didn't understand the seal his dragon eyes had flagged back in the hidden dungeon, not fully, but instinct told him the weapon responded to intent rather than command, the same way his brother's inherited memories had responded to genuine need rather than deliberate effort. He stopped trying to force an answer and let the fight itself demand one instead, committing fully to a strike he knew wouldn't land clean against Fonte's guard. The blade answered. Me too. Dark energy poured from the dagger's edge. The instant contact seemed inevitable, a surge that split Fonte's guard clean in half and sent the larger man staggering backward, with a wound along his forearm deep enough to end the fight on its own. Fonte looked down at the injury with something closer to delight than pain, laughing through gritted teeth as he conceded the match, telling Yunwoo he'd finally found an opponent worth remembering. The crowd's reaction this time wasn't murmurs. It was silence, the specific kind that follows genuine shock, followed a heartbeat later by a rising wave of questions nobody in the stands could answer. Adora stood at the edge of her section, arms crossed, watching him walk out of the pit with an expression that had stopped hiding its interest entirely. The final match was against Khan. Neither of them wanted it any more than Yunwoo and Doyle had wanted theirs, but the tower didn't care what anyone wanted. Khan approached the center with none of Fonte's excitement, only a grim, professional focus that suggested he understood exactly how much this fight would cost, regardless of outcome. He told Yunwoo, quietly, that he respected whatever the stranger was hiding, and that respect wouldn't stop him from fighting at full strength. Yunwoo told him he'd have been disappointed if it did. Khan's style relied on measured, controlled strikes. Nothing wasted. Every movement calculated the way a chess player considers 3 moves ahead before touching a single piece. It was the hardest fight of the day precisely because Khan gave him nothing to exploit, no obvious openings, no predictable rhythm to map the way he had with the twin-blade woman earlier. For long minutes, the fight settled into a grinding exchange of blocked strikes and cautious repositioning, both fighters testing without committing. The break came from an old soldier's trick rather than anything the tower had taught him. Yunwoo deliberately let his guard drop on his left side, a controlled mistake rather than a real one, baiting Khan into the single opening he'd been waiting for the entire match. Khan took the bait, committed his weight fully into what should have been a finishing blow, and Yunwoo redirected the strike past his shoulder while driving the dagger home along Khan's exposed side. It wasn't a killing blow. It didn't need to be. Khan's knees buckled, and he conceded the match with a short, exhausted nod, respect written plainly across his face despite the loss. Yunwoo had won the tutorial. The announcement voice returned overhead, calm and mechanical as always, confirming his position as the highest-ranked participant across the entire tutorial cycle. Rewards began materializing in the air above the pit, a cascade of items that drew audible gasps even from players who had already claimed their own prizes earlier that day. Rare potions, a stack of skill books bound in unfamiliar leather, a small pouch that hummed faintly with contained mana, and last, floating apart from everything else, a single golden key shaped like a stylized thunderbolt, pulsing with a light that seemed to pull attention toward it regardless of anyone's intention to look away. The announcement named it Zeus's Key, and offered no further explanation beyond a brief note that it would unlock something significant once he reached a threshold still undisclosed. Yunwu closed his hand around it and felt a faint pulse answer back, like something ancient recognizing a debt owed rather than a prize claimed. Khan approached him afterward, wound already bound, and told him plainly that he'd never seen anyone play an entire tutorial as quietly as Yunwu had, hiding strength that could have easily topped every leaderboard from the second stage onward. He asked, one final time, whether Yunwu might reconsider joining forces once they entered the real tower beyond this tutorial. Yunwu told him he appreciated the offer and that he wasn't ready to commit to anyone yet, not until he'd settled something older than the tutorial itself. Khan studied him for a long moment, then simply nodded, the kind of nod that left the door open rather than closing it. Adora found him last, waiting near the pit's exit with her arms still crossed, watching him with open curiosity now that pretense had stopped serving any purpose. She told him she'd never seen someone win an entire tutorial while trying this hard not to be seen at all, and asked what exactly he was running from, or running toward. Yunwu didn't answer that either. He only told her that the tutorial was over, and that whatever came next inside the actual tower would probably answer her question better than he could right now. Ule caught up to him as the crowd began dispersing, her earlier exhaustion replaced by something closer to quiet awe. She told him she'd known he was strong, but she hadn't understood exactly how strong until she watched him fight Khan in that final match. She asked, half joking, whether he was finally going to tell her his real name now that the entire tutorial had already learned it from the announcement itself. He told her his name was Che Yun-woo, and that yes, that was the truth this time, no games attached. Something in her expression eased at that, like a small trust finally confirmed after an entire tutorial of careful, guarded companionship. The tutorial doors sealed behind the last group of surviving players, and a new set of doors began forming ahead, taller than anything they'd walked through so far, marked with symbols none of them recognized. The announcement voice returned one final time, informing every surviving participant that the actual tower now stood open before them, and that their true climb had only just begun. Yunwu closed his fist around the pocket watch in his pocket, feeling its familiar warmth beneath his palm, and thought about his brother's final recorded words, the promise he'd made in the silence of an empty apartment before any of this had started. The tutorial had been a test, nothing more. Somewhere above these doors waited the people who had actually killed his brother, hiding behind the same clans and organizations that had once promised Min protection before delivering betrayal instead. He stepped through the new doors without hesitation, Uli close behind him, Khan and Doyle a short distance further back, Adora watching his retreating figure with an expression that hadn't fully settled on curiosity or something warmer. Somewhere far above them, inside towers and floors none of them had seen yet, the people responsible for his brother's death had no idea a masked soldier from the world below had just spent an entire tutorial quietly becoming exactly strong enough to find them. The floor beneath the new doors wasn't stone. It was something closer to packed earth, warm and faintly damp, and the sky overhead had no visible source of light despite glowing bright as midday. Yunwu noticed the wrongness of it before anyone spoke a single word. The kind of detail his old training had taught him to flag instantly. A battlefield that didn't follow rules his body understood. A notification bloomed across everyone's vision at once, the same mechanical voice from the tutorial now carrying a slightly different weight. Colder somehow, less patient with newcomers who no longer had training wheels to lean on. It announced the first floor, welcomed surviving tutorial graduates, and warned that death here was permanent in every sense the tutorial had only pretended to threaten. Ule went pale reading that line. Doyle muttered something about wishing the announcement had led with better news. Khan said nothing, already scanning the tree line at the edge of the clearing with the flat, professional focus of a man who had clearly expected exactly this. Yunwu felt something different settle over him, quieter than fear, closer to recognition. His brother had stood on ground like this once, in memories he now carried as if they were his own. Min had described the first floor in fragments. a jungle that swallowed sound, clans already carving out territory before most tutorial graduates even understood the rules had changed. They didn't get long to orient themselves. A horn sounded somewhere deep in the tree line, low and resonant, the kind of sound built to travel for miles, and every player who had spent even a week in this world apparently knew exactly what it meant. Khan's jaw tightened. He told the group, without elaborating further, that the horn belonged to a clan patrol marking territory, and that ignoring it usually cost more than acknowledging it. Khan hesitated a half-second too long before answering, and that hesitation told Yunwoo more than the actual name did. Blue Sword. The name landed like a physical weight settling into his chest, and for a moment, the clearing around him blurred at the edges, replaced by fragments of memory he hadn't asked for. His brother's voice, tight with controlled panic, warning his party about a clan that operated less like fighters and more like a business built on other people's suffering. Human farms, his brother had called them once, in a memory Yunwoo had tried hard not to dwell on. Places where captured or indebted players vanished into experiments nobody outside the clan ever heard about again. He kept his face still. Years of training had taught him that much at least, how to bury a reaction somewhere the enemy couldn't read it. Ule noticed anyway, glancing at him with quiet concern that he waved off with a small shake of his head. The patrol found them within the hour, 6 armed figures moving through the undergrowth, with the loose, confident stride of people who had never lost a fight on this particular stretch of jungle. Their leader was young, maybe younger than Doyle, but carried himself with the practiced arrogance of someone who had grown up believing the world owed him deference. He introduced himself as Reyes, a mid-tier enforcer for Blue Sword, and informed the group in a bored, rehearsed tone that this stretch of the first floor fell under clan protection, and that continued passage required either clan affiliation or an appropriate toll. Khan's hand drifted toward his weapon, slow enough not to provoke immediate violence, but obvious enough to communicate he wasn't afraid of the consequences. Reyes noticed and smiled, the expression of someone who genuinely believed 6 against 5 favored his side regardless of individual skill. Yunwoo stepped forward before Khan could answer, and something in his posture, calm in a way that had nothing to do with bravado, made Reyes's smile falter slightly. He asked Reyes a simple question, whether Blue Sword still ran operations connected to captured players, the kind that never resurfaced once taken. Reyes's expression shifted, confusion first, then a flicker of something closer to wariness, though he covered it quickly with forced bravado. He asked why a nameless tutorial graduate would care about internal clan business that had nothing to do with him. Yunwoo told him it had everything to do with him, and that the answer to his question would decide whether this conversation ended peacefully or didn't end at all. The fight started before Reyes finished deciding how to respond to that. One of the patrol members lunged first, a spear thrust aimed at closing the distance before Yunwoo could react, and Yunwoo's body answered on pure instinct, old soldier's reflexes carrying him half a step sideways before the spear tip ever reached him. He caught the shaft with one hand, used the attacker's own momentum to pull him off balance, and ended the exchange with a strike that put the man down without a wasted motion. Khan moved a half-second later, meeting a second attacker head-on with the measured, economical style Yunwoo remembered from their tutorial match. Doyle's summoned insects swarmed a third, driving the man back into a tangle of undergrowth that slowed him just enough for Ule to land a disabling spell along his legs. Reyes watched 2 more of his patrol fall within the same span of seconds it had taken him to decide whether this fight was actually happening, and something in his composure finally cracked. He shouted for the remaining members to fall back, clearly recalculating the odds he'd walked in assuming were guaranteed. Yunwoo caught him before he could retreat fully, closing the distance with a speed Reyes plainly hadn't accounted for, and put the enforcer on his knees with a single controlled strike aimed to disable rather than kill. He crouched in front of Reyes afterward, voice quiet, almost gentle in a way that made the threat underneath it land harder than shouting ever could. He repeated his earlier question, whether Blue Sword still operated facilities where captured players disappeared. Reyes, breathing hard, finally admitted it, more from fear than any loyalty breaking. Yes, somewhere on a floor higher than this one, though he claimed not to know the exact location himself, only that senior members oversaw it personally, a man named Will, chief among them. Will. The name settled into Yunwoo's memory alongside a face he'd seen only once, in a fragment his brother's watch had shown him weeks earlier, a senior clan member standing near the edge of a battle Min hadn't survived. He hadn't understood the significance of that face until this exact moment. Now it clicked into place like a missing piece finally locating its socket. He let Reyes go afterward, not out of mercy exactly, but because a frightened, humiliated enforcer crawling back to report a defeat served his purposes better than a dead one ever could. Word would spread. Blue Sword would learn a masked stranger had asked about their operations by name, and that stranger would learn exactly how they responded to the pressure. Khan watched him release Reyes with an unreadable expression, then asked quietly, once the enforcer had fled into the tree line, exactly what history existed between Yunwu and a clan most tutorial graduates hadn't even heard of yet. Yunwu didn't answer immediately. He looked at Uli first, then at Doyle, both watching him with the particular attentiveness of people who had already decided he was worth trusting despite barely knowing him. Something in their expressions, open and unguarded, reminded him uncomfortably of his brother's old party. People who had trusted each other completely until trust became the very thing that killed them. He told them only the essential truth, stripped of detail he wasn't ready to share. His brother had died on this floor, or one near it, killed by people connected to this exact clan. He was here to find out exactly who, and exactly why. Ule's face went soft, with something between sympathy and understanding. Doyle looked away, uncomfortable in the specific way young men get when confronted with grief they don't know how to address properly. Khan simply nodded once, filing the information away without pushing further, though something in his posture shifted, subtly protective in a way it hadn't been before. Adora, who had said little since stepping through the doors, finally spoke, her voice quieter than her usual sharp confidence. She told him that if Blue Sword was involved, they'd need more than 5 people eventually, because the clan's reach extended further than most tutorial graduates ever fully understood until it was too late. Yunwu didn't disagree. He also didn't commit to anything beyond the immediate moment, some old caution still holding him back from trusting this group with the full weight of what he intended to do once he found the people responsible. They made camp that night near a shallow stream, the jungle around them alive with sounds none of them recognized, distant calls that might have been monsters, or might have been other clan patrols marking territory the same way Blue Sword had. Ule took first watch, insisting she wasn't tired despite the exhaustion still evident in her posture. Doyle fell asleep almost immediately, curled near the dying embers of a small fire Khan had built with practiced efficiency. Yunwu sat apart from the group, turning the pocket watch over in his hands the way he had 100 times since first activating it. He didn't open it that night. Some instinct told him the memories inside deserved rationing, saved for moments when he genuinely needed the reminder of why he was here rather than treated as casual comfort. Adora found him there eventually, settling nearby without asking permission, the kind of quiet confidence that assumed her presence wouldn't be unwelcome. She didn't ask about his brother again. Instead, she asked what he'd been before the tower, back in whatever life existed beyond these walls. He told her the truth, or most of it. A soldier. Someone who had spent years being told exactly who to protect and exactly who to fight, until the fighting stopped meaning anything beyond the orders themselves. She studied him for a long moment, firelight catching the edge of her expression, and told him that explained a great deal about the way he moved. Calculated and economical, nothing wasted, nothing performed for an audience. She said most tower fighters eventually developed a kind of theater to their combat, an unconscious need to be seen fighting well. He had none of that. Yunwu didn't have a ready answer for the observation, so he simply let the silence sit between them, comfortable in a way he hadn't expected given how recently they'd met. Something about her attention felt different from the careful trust he was building with Khan or Ule, sharper somehow, more personal. He didn't examine that feeling too closely. There would be time for it later, if there was a later at all, and right now every part of him remained fixed on the name Reyes had given him, Will. A senior Blue Sword member connected to a facility where captured players simply vanished. Somewhere above this floor, inside walls he hadn't seen yet, that man had no idea a masked stranger from a world he'd never bothered to remember had just learned his name, and had already decided exactly what would happen once they finally stood in the same room. Reyes did exactly what Yunwu expected. Word reached Blue Sword patrols within 2 days, whispers of a masked stranger asking about facilities the clan preferred nobody discussed openly, and by the 3rd day, a different kind of attention started following the group through the jungle. They noticed the tracker first, a lean man in dark leathers who kept a careful distance, close enough to observe, far enough to vanish if confronted directly. Khan spotted him during their second night's watch, and said nothing to the others until morning, unwilling to spook Doyle or Yule into a mistake born from panic. Yunwoo handled it the way he handled most problems that required patience rather than force. He let the tracker believe he remained unnoticed for another full day, gathering whatever information the man intended to report, then doubled back through a stretch of dense undergrowth and waited exactly where the tracker's habitual path would carry him. The confrontation lasted less than a minute. The tracker, a mid-level blue sword scout named Korin, surrendered the moment Yunwoo's blade found his throat, admitting under pressure that senior leadership had grown curious about the stranger who'd humiliated Reyes. Curious enough to send someone quieter to observe, rather than another patrol to intimidate. Yunwoo asked him directly whether he knew Will personally. Korin hesitated long enough that the answer became obvious before he spoke it aloud. Yes, though only by reputation and rare sightings during clan assemblies. Will operated 3 floors up, overseeing what Korin carefully avoided naming outright, referring to it only as processing, a term that made something cold settle in Yunwoo's stomach even before Korin finished the sentence. He let Korin live too, on the same calculation as before. A frightened scout reporting failure served better than a body blue sword would use as justification for open war before Yunwoo was ready for one. Khan raised the obvious concern once Korin had fled. Every enemy they released walked straight back to report exactly how much Yunwoo already knew, and eventually Blue Sword would stop sending scouts and start sending something heavier. Yunwoo didn't disagree. He simply told Khan that heavier attention meant Blue Sword would eventually make a mistake born from urgency, and mistakes born from urgency were easier to exploit than careful, patient hostility. Ule watched this exchange with growing unease, and that night, once Doyle had drifted off near the fire, she finally asked the question she'd clearly been holding back for days. She asked whether Yunwoo intended to kill Will once he found him, or whether there was some version of this that ended with answers instead of bodies. Yunwoo considered the question longer than he expected to. He told her honestly that he didn't know yet, that the answer probably depended on what Will actually said once cornered, and how much responsibility the man carried personally versus simply following orders from someone above him. Ul didn't look satisfied with that answer, but she didn't push further either, watching him with the particular caution of someone recalibrating exactly how far this quiet, careful stranger was willing to go once his patience finally ran out. They pushed toward the stairwell to the second floor 3 days later, following directions Korin had reluctantly provided under pressure, a narrow ravine most tutorial graduates avoided due to the density of monsters patrolling its length. Yunwoo's instincts, sharpened by memories that weren't originally his, recognized the ravine from a fragment his brother had once described, a shortcut Min had used to bypass a blue sword checkpoint during an earlier, more desperate stretch of his own climb. The monsters there were worse than anything the tutorial had prepared them for. Lean gray wolves with too many joints in their legs, moving in coordinated packs that clearly hunted together rather than individually. The first encounter nearly cost Doyle his arm, a wolf closing distance faster than his summoned insects could intercept, and only Khan's interception at the last possible instant kept the injury to a shallow gash instead of something permanent. Yunwoo fought differently here than he had in the tutorial, forced to account for a pack mentality rather than isolated opponents. And for the first time since activating the watch, he found himself relying heavily on the fragmented combat memories his brother had left behind, half-formed instincts about pack hunting patterns that Min himself had apparently learned the hard way on this exact stretch of ground. They cleared the ravine after nearly 2 hours of grinding, exhausted, several members carrying wounds that would need proper treatment before continuing. Adora, who had fought alongside them the entire stretch with a quiet efficiency Yunwoo was beginning to genuinely respect, suggested they rest at a nearby waypoint rather than pushing straight through toward the stairwell exhausted. Yunwoo agreed, mostly because Ule's mana reserves had run dangerously low and Doyle's wound needed real attention rather than the field dressing Khan had managed during the fight itself. The waypoint turned out to be a small settlement, the kind that existed on every floor according to fragments of his brother's memory. Neutral ground where merchants and travelers gathered under an uneasy truce that even hostile clans generally respected. Yunwoo recognized the merchant stalls immediately, similar enough to the tutorial's own merchant system that he understood the underlying logic without needing explanation. It was here, while Ule negotiated for healing supplies and Doyle rested near a modest fire, that Yunwoo overheard something that changed the shape of everything he thought he understood about his brother's death. Two Blue Sword members, off-duty and careless with drink, were discussing a woman by name, complaining about her recent promotion within clan ranks despite what one of them called her messy history with outsiders. The name they used was Sarah. Yunwoo's entire body went still. His brother's memories held that name too, attached to a woman with sharp eyes and a softer smile, the same woman who had put a blade through Min's chest while his trusted allies watched and did nothing. He hadn't known her name with certainty until this exact moment, only her face, burned into memory through his brother's dying recollection. He approached the two drinking men carefully, adopting the same quiet, unthreatening posture he'd used to draw information from Reyes and Corin before them. He asked, casually, whether this Sarah had always been Blue Sword, or whether she'd come from somewhere else originally. The drunker of the two answered without much caution, explaining that she'd transferred in a couple years back, some falling out with an independent party she'd apparently betrayed for a much better position within a real clan structure. He laughed at that, calling it smart business, the kind of ruthless practicality that got people ahead in a place like this. Yunwoo kept his expression neutral through sheer force of will, though something inside him had gone cold and very still. The specific stillness that used to settle over him right before a mission turned from planning into execution. He asked one more question, careful not to reveal how much the answer would matter. Whether Sarah still operated near this floor, or whether her position had moved her somewhere higher up. The man shrugged, uninterested now that the conversation had stopped being entertaining gossip, and said she rotated between assignments, though rumor placed her currently stationed near Will's operation, working close protection for the senior members overseeing whatever Blue Sword ran on the higher floors. Working close protection for Will specifically, the two threads Yunwoo had been pulling on separately, the man responsible for whatever facility swallowed captured players, and the woman who'd murdered his brother with her own hand, had just converged into the same location. He returned to his own group that night quieter than usual, and Adora noticed immediately, settling beside him near their own small fire with the same easy confidence she'd shown every night since the jungle patrol. She asked what he'd learned that had visibly rattled someone who otherwise moved through danger without any outward reaction at all. He almost didn't answer. Something about the accumulated weight of the last few days, the fight in the ravine, the overheard conversation, the sudden collision of grief and purpose finally converging into an actual target, made the careful distance he usually maintained feel harder to hold on to than usual. He told her a version of the truth, more than he'd shared with anyone since stepping into the tower. His brother hadn't simply died fighting monsters. He'd been betrayed by people he trusted, murdered by a woman who claimed to love him. And that same woman now worked protection for the exact man overseeing whatever horror Blue Sword ran on the floors above them. Adora listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she didn't offer empty comfort or performative sympathy. She simply told him that revenge built on grief this specific rarely stayed clean, and asked whether he'd considered what came after, assuming he actually found both of them and did whatever he intended to do. Yunwoo didn't have an answer for that either. He told her honestly that he hadn't let himself think that far ahead, that the only clear thought guiding him since his brother's death had been finding the people responsible, with everything beyond that existing as a kind of blank space he hadn't allowed himself to examine. She studied him for a long moment in the firelight, something unreadable behind her usual sharp confidence, and told him that when he was ready to think about that blank space, she'd be willing to listen. Then she left him to his thoughts, retreating to her own bedroll without pushing the conversation further. Khan approached him the following morning before the group broke camp, direct in the way Yunwoo had come to expect from him. He told Yunwoo plainly that he'd overheard enough of the previous night's conversation to understand the shape of what was coming, and that whatever happened once they reached Will's operation, Khan intended to stand with him regardless of the danger. Doyle echoed the sentiment moments later, less eloquent but no less sincere, insisting that anyone willing to walk into Blue Sword territory for a reason, this personal deserved backup rather than hesitation. Ule said nothing immediately, still visibly wrestling with the same question she'd raised days earlier, about how far this quiet stranger was willing to go once he found what he was looking for. But when the group finally moved out toward the stairwell leading to the second floor, she walked beside him same as always, her silence more a private reckoning than any withdrawal of support. Yunwoo felt the weight of their loyalty settle over him as they climbed, an unfamiliar sensation after years of operating alone, first as a soldier following orders, then as a grieving brother pursuing revenge in solitary, careful silence. He hadn't planned on allies, He certainly hadn't planned on people willing to bleed for a cause that was entirely his own. Somewhere above them, on a floor he hadn't seen yet, Will continued whatever operation had swallowed his brother's trust and eventually his life, unaware that the quiet, masked stranger who'd humiliated one of his enforcers weeks ago now knew both his name and the name of the woman standing at his side, and had already begun closing the distance between them one floor at a time. The stairwell to the second floor turned out to be exactly that, an actual staircase carved into a cliff face, wide enough for 10 people walking shoulder to shoulder, guarded at intervals by administrator constructs that watched without interfering unless someone attempted to bypass the climb entirely. Yunwoo counted the guard posts as they climbed, an old habit from a life that had trained him to map every route before trusting it. Ule asked, halfway up, whether the constructs would intervene if Blue Sword attacked them on these stairs. Khan answered before Yunwoo could, explaining that administrators enforced tower rules rather than clan politics, meaning violence here was permitted so long as it didn't damage the stairwell itself. Blue Sword knew that as well as anyone, which meant an ambush on the climb remained entirely possible. None came. Whether that meant Blue Sword hadn't yet decided how seriously to take the threat Yunwoo represented, or whether they were simply waiting for better ground, nobody in the group could say for certain. The second floor opened into something closer to an actual city than the raw jungle below. Stone buildings rising in uneven clusters, streets crowded with players and merchants and the occasional armored patrol marking clan colors Yunwoo didn't recognize. The air here smelled different too, less like earth and more like wood smoke and old stone, the particular scent of a place that had been inhabited long enough to accumulate its own atmosphere. Blue Sword's presence was immediately obvious. Banners hanging from several of the larger buildings, patrols moving through the streets with the loose confidence of an organization that controlled this territory without serious challenge. Yunwoo kept the group moving without lingering, aware that even in a crowd, a masked stranger who'd already humiliated two of the clan's members might draw more attention than he wanted this early. They found lodging in a quieter district, a modest inn run by a woman who asked no questions, so long as payment came in karma rather than promises. Ule spent the evening researching what she could through public boards and careful conversation with other travelers, while Khan and Doyle scouted the district's layout, mapping routes that avoided Blue Sword's heaviest patrol concentrations. Yunwoo spent that first night differently. He opened the pocket watch again, alone in the small room he'd taken, and let another fragment of his brother's memory unfold around him. This one was quieter than the others, less violence, more warmth. Min sitting with his party around a fire much like the one they'd shared in the jungle days earlier, laughing at something Sarah had said, her hand resting briefly against his arm in a gesture that read as unmistakably tender. Yunwoo watched his brother's face in that memory, younger looking than he had any right to be given how much the tower had already taken from him, and felt something twist painfully in his own chest at how genuinely happy Min appeared in that single unguarded moment. That was the cruelty of it, he realized, watching the memory play out to its quiet end. Sarah hadn't simply used his brother, she'd made him believe, for however long, that someone in this brutal place actually loved him. The betrayal wasn't just a blade through the chest, it was every gentle moment before it, weaponized in retrospect. He closed the watch before the memory could continue toward its inevitable ending, unwilling to relive that particular scene again so soon after his conversation with Adora. Morning brought new information from Ule, gathered through careful, patient conversation with a merchant who'd once done business with Blue Sword before some falling out neither of them explained fully. According to her sources, Will's operations sat in a converted warehouse near the district's northern edge, heavily guarded, officially registered as a processing facility for captured monster cores, though everyone who'd actually seen inside apparently knew better than to repeat what they'd witnessed. Sarah, according to the same source, split her time between personal duties for Will and command over a small elite unit tasked with intercepting anyone who asked too many questions about the facility's real purpose. Yunwoo absorbed this information with the same careful stillness he'd shown since learning her name, though Adora, watching him across their small shared table, clearly noticed the tension building beneath his composure regardless of how well he hid it. She suggested, practically, that a direct assault on a heavily guarded facility with only 5 people, however capable, amounted to a plan built on desperation rather than strategy. Khan agreed immediately, adding that Blue Sword's numbers on this floor likely outmatched anything 5 tutorial graduates could realistically overcome through brute force alone. Yunwoo didn't argue the logic. He'd learned that lesson from watching his brother's memories play out. The cost of committing to a fight before understanding the actual terrain. And he had no intention of repeating that specific mistake, now that the stakes involved people who'd chosen to stand beside him. They spent the next several days gathering intelligence rather than acting, a patience that visibly tested Doyle's temperament more than the others, his usual easy humor souring slightly under the pressure of proximity to a threat that hadn't materialized yet. Yunwoo understood the frustration without sharing it fully. Years of military discipline having taught him that waiting for the right moment mattered more than satisfying the impulse to act immediately. The break came from an unexpected direction. A young woman approached their table at the inn one evening, nervous, glancing repeatedly toward the door as though expecting to be followed. She introduced herself only as a former facility worker, someone who'd escaped Blue Sword's employment months earlier after witnessing something she refused to describe in detail, carrying guilt heavy enough that she'd apparently been searching for someone willing to actually do something about it, rather than simply listen. She'd heard whispers about a masked stranger asking questions that made Blue Sword nervous, and decided the risk of approaching them directly was worth the possibility that someone might finally act. Yunwoo listened to her carefully, recognizing in her fear the same helpless anger he carried himself, just directed at a smaller, more personal scale. She described the facility's internal layout as best she remembered it: guard rotations, a weak point along the eastern wall where deliveries came through with less scrutiny than the main entrance, and confirmed that Sarah oversaw security personally during Will's most sensitive processing sessions. She also confirmed something Yunwoo hadn't asked about directly, something that made the room go very quiet once she said it. Will kept records, detailed ones, of every player processed through the facility, names and origins, and the specific circumstances of their capture, apparently out of some perverse pride in the operation's efficiency rather than any practical necessity. If those records existed, they would confirm exactly what had happened to his brother, and exactly who besides Sarah had played a role in delivering him into Blue Sword's hands. The former worker left before finishing her drink, still visibly frightened by how much she'd already risked simply by speaking to them, and Yunwoo let her go without pressing for anything more, grateful enough for what she'd already provided. That night, the group finally began building an actual plan rather than simply gathering fragments of information. Khan sketched a rough diagram of the facility based on the worker's description, marking the weak eastern wall and the likely guard rotations. Doyle, energy finally given a productive outlet, worked through several approaches for using his summoned insects as scouts rather than direct combatants, minimizing the risk of early detection. Ule handled the logistics of supplies, healing potions, and the specific reagents she'd need if things went wrong once they were inside. Adora, surprising everyone slightly, revealed a working knowledge of facility security systems from some unspecified prior experience, information she offered without elaboration when Doyle asked how she happened to know so much about bypassing administrator-grade locks. Yunwoo watched his makeshift group assemble a plan around a mission that had started as entirely his own, and felt something shift in his chest that he didn't immediately have a name for, something between gratitude and a specific, aching guilt at how easily he'd let them become entangled in a war they had no personal stake in, beyond loyalty to him. He told them, once the plan's rough shape had settled, that none of them owed him this, that he'd understand completely if any of them wanted to step back before things turned genuinely dangerous rather than merely tense. Khan answered first, flatly, telling him that loyalty wasn't something that came with an expiration date once real danger appeared, and that he'd made his choice back on the first floor when Blue Sword's patrol drew steel first. Doyle echoed the sentiment with less gravity but equal sincerity. Uli simply looked at him, quiet and steady, and said that she remembered exactly what it felt like to be cornered with no one willing to help, and had no intention of letting that happen to someone else while she had the power to prevent it. Adora said nothing immediately, watching him across the small room with an expression he was beginning to recognize as specifically hers, equal parts challenge and warmth. Then she told him, simply, that she'd already decided to stay long before this conversation started, and that repeating the offer to leave wouldn't change anything except waste time they didn't have. Yunwoo didn't have words adequate to that moment, so he simply nodded, accepting what he hadn't expected to find inside a place built almost entirely from betrayal and loss. They moved on the facility 3 nights later, under cover of a moonless dark that Doyle's insects had confirmed matched the lightest guard rotation the former worker had described. Yun-woo felt the old, familiar calm settle over him as they approached the eastern wall, the same steady focus that had carried him through every mission in his old life, sharpened now by something his soldier's training had never carried before, a grief transformed finally into direct, purposeful action. Somewhere inside that building, Will oversaw whatever horror justified the word processing, unaware that tonight, the debt his operation had accumulated through his brother's death was finally coming due. Somewhere close to him, Sarah stood guard over secrets she'd helped bury years ago, with no idea the man she'd once claimed to love had a brother who remembered everything she'd done, carried inside a watch that never stopped ticking toward this exact moment. The eastern wall gave way exactly where the former worker had promised, a delivery gate secured by a lock Adora disabled in under a minute, her fingers moving with the practiced ease of someone who'd clearly done this kind of work before, whatever unspoken history she carried behind that skill. Doyle's insects had already scouted the immediate corridor beyond, confirming 2 guards stationed near a storage room rather than the heavier presence patrolling the main entrance. Khan took the guards down quietly, one after another, before either could raise an alarm. Yun-woo led the group deeper, following the layout the former worker had sketched from memory, past storage rooms stacked with crates that Ule identified by smell alone as containing preserved monster cores. Exactly the cover story Blue Sword used to justify the facility's existence to anyone who asked too few questions. The deeper corridors told a different story. Cells lined one hallway, most empty now, though the lingering smell and the scratch marks along the stone walls made their former purpose impossible to mistake for anything else. Ule's breath caught audibly at the sight. Doyle went quiet in a way that suggested he was fighting down something closer to nausea than fear. Yun-woo kept moving, forcing himself to catalog the details rather than dwell on them, the same discipline that had carried him through worse sights during his years in uniform. He would have time to feel the full weight of this later. Right now, feeling it fully would only slow him down. They found the records room exactly where the former worker had indicated. A locked office adjoining what looked like a processing chamber. Medical equipment arranged with a clinical precision that made the room somehow worse than the cells outside it. Adora made quick work of this lock too, and Yun-woo stepped inside alone while the others held the corridor, some instinct telling him this was a moment he needed to face without an audience. The records were exactly as detailed as promised, ledgers stacked along a single shelf, each entry marked with a name, an origin, and a brief note on circumstances of capture. Yun-woo found his brother's entry faster than he expected to, as though some part of him had known precisely where to look. Min's name, followed by a note that read simply, acquired through internal betrayal, asset compromised prior to extraction, terminated during retrieval attempt. Terminated during retrieval attempt. The clinical wording made something in his chest crack open in a way even his brother's raw, bleeding memories hadn't managed. His brother's death, reduced to a bureaucratic footnote in someone else's ledger, filed alongside dozens of other names that had apparently suffered the exact same fate. He didn't have time to process the weight of it fully before a voice spoke from the doorway behind him. Calm, faintly amused, entirely unsurprised. "You found it faster than I expected," the voice said. "Most people who make it this far don't have the stomach to actually read what's in there." Yun-woo turned to find a man standing in the doorway, older than he expected, gray threading through dark hair, an expression of mild professional curiosity rather than any real alarm. "Will," he asked, without preamble, how a masked stranger had managed to slip past facility security without triggering a single alarm, genuine curiosity rather than fear coloring the question. Yun-woo didn't answer that. He asked his own question instead, voice steady despite everything churning beneath it. He asked whether Will remembered a man named Min, processed through this facility roughly 2 years earlier. Something flickered across Will's expression, brief calculation rather than guilt, the look of a man mentally flipping through an enormous catalog of names. He admitted, after a moment, that the name meant nothing specific to him personally, that he oversaw hundreds of cases and couldn't be expected to remember individual details without consulting the records himself. That admission, more than any confession could have, told Yun-woo everything he needed to know about the man standing in front of him. His brother's death hadn't been personal to Will at all. It had been paperwork, One entry among hundreds, processed and filed and forgotten within days. Yunwoo told him the name meant everything to him, because Min had been his younger brother, and asked whether Will intended to explain what exactly this facility processed players for, or whether he preferred Yunwoo simply find out himself by reading through every remaining ledger on that shelf. Will's calm slipped slightly at that, recalculating the situation now that personal motive had entered a conversation he'd clearly expected to remain professional. He called out sharply, a name that confirmed Yunwoo's worst suspicion before she even appeared. Sarah stepped into the doorway a moment later, armored, weapon already drawn, eyes narrowing on the masked figure standing over Will's shoulder in the records room. She asked Will, without looking away from Yunwoo, whether this was the stranger who'd been causing problems on the lower floors. Will confirmed it, backing carefully toward the door while gesturing for her to handle the threat directly. Yunwoo watched Sarah's face as recognition slowly built behind her eyes, some flicker of memory surfacing as she studied the mask, the posture, something in his stance that apparently echoed a man she'd once known well enough to betray. He reached up and pulled the mask away before she could fully place it, wanting her to see his face clearly when he said what came next. "You knew my brother," he said quietly. "Min." Sarah's weapon lowered a fraction, shock replacing the professional focus she'd walked in with. She stared at him for a long moment, searching his features for the resemblance that had apparently just clicked into place, and something like genuine distress crossed her expression before she managed to smooth it back into practiced neutrality. She asked, voice tighter than before, what exactly he thought he knew. Yunwoo told her everything, flatly, without theatrical anger, because the memory itself carried enough weight without needing embellishment. He told her he'd watched the memory of her blade entering his brother's chest, watched the exact moment Min's trust shattered into betrayal, carried in a watch that had shown him every detail she probably assumed had died with the only witness. Sarah's composure cracked fully at that, something raw and unguarded surfacing beneath the armor and the years since. She told him, voice unsteady now, that it hadn't been simple, that Blue Sword had given her no real choice once her own position within the clan came under threat for her association with an independent party, that Min's death had been the price of her own survival rather than something she'd wanted. Yunwoo asked her whether that justification had made it easier to drive the blade home, while he looked at her with an expression that held no room left for anything but understanding what she'd done to him. Sarah had no answer to that. She simply stood there, weapon still lowered, caught between the woman who had apparently convinced herself the betrayal was necessary and the one now confronted directly by its living consequence. Will, watching this exchange from near the doorway, seemed to recalculate his own priorities the moment he realized Sarah's attention had fully shifted away from defending the facility. He turned to flee down the corridor, only to find Khan blocking the exit, weapon already drawn, expression flat and unforgiving. The fight that followed was fast and brutal, Sarah's loyalty finally splitting between self-preservation and whatever remained of genuine feeling for a man she'd once claimed to love. Hesitating just long enough at the critical moment that Yunwoo's dagger found an opening, her earlier reflexes would never have allowed. She went down hard, wounded rather than killed, staring up at him with an expression that held more relief than fear, as though some part of her had been waiting years for this exact reckoning. Will's fight lasted considerably less time. Khan and Doyle cornered him before he made it halfway down the corridor, and whatever authority the man carried within Blue Sword's structure evaporated entirely once actual violence replaced the careful, clinical distance he was used to operating behind. Yunwoo arrived in time to watch Khan's blade end it, quick and merciless, no ceremony attached to a death that had been owed to dozens of forgotten names on that record shelf. Sarah remained on the ground, breathing hard, watching Yunwoo approach with the dagger still in hand. She asked, quietly, whether he intended to finish this the same way Will's fight had ended. Yunwoo stood over her for a long moment, weighing something he hadn't fully decided until this exact instant. He told her, finally, that killing her wouldn't bring his brother back, and that some part of him suspected she'd already been living inside a punishment worse than death long before tonight, trapped by a choice she clearly hadn't stopped regretting. He left her alive, badly wounded, disarmed, with the records room's contents already being gathered by Ule for evidence that would eventually reach administrators willing to investigate Blue Sword's real operations. Whatever fate awaited Sarah now belonged to consequences beyond his own hand, and something about leaving that judgment to someone other than himself felt like the first genuinely clean decision he'd made since his brother's death. They left the facility before dawn, records secured. The immediate threat of Will's operation ended, though Blue Sword itself remained a far larger organization than one dead senior member could meaningfully cripple. Yunwoo understood that clearly enough. Tonight had closed one wound. It hadn't ended the war his brother's death had started, only proven that the war could actually be fought, and won, piece by piece, name by name. Somewhere above them, higher floors waited, holding whatever remained of the people and organizations connected to his brother's betrayal, unaware that the masked stranger who just ended Will's operation had no intention of stopping here. The eastern wall gave way exactly where the former worker had promised. A delivery gate secured by a lock Adora disabled in under a minute, her fingers moving with the practiced ease of someone who'd clearly done this kind of work before, whatever unspoken history she carried behind that skill. Doyle's insects had already scouted the immediate corridor beyond, confirming 2 guards stationed near a storage room rather than the heavier presence patrolling the main entrance. Khan took the guards down quietly, one after another, before either could raise an alarm. Yunwoo led the group deeper, following the layout the former worker had sketched from memory, past storage rooms stacked with crates that Ule identified by smell alone as containing preserved monster cores. Exactly the cover story Blue Sword used to justify the facility's existence to anyone who asked too few questions. The deeper corridors told a different story. Cells lined one hallway, most empty now, though the lingering smell and the scratch marks along the stone walls made their former purpose impossible to mistake for anything else. Ule's breath caught audibly at the sight. Doyle went quiet in a way that suggested he was fighting down something closer to nausea than fear. Yunwoo kept moving, forcing himself to catalog the details rather than dwell on them, the same discipline that had carried him through worse sights during his years in uniform. He would have time to feel the full weight of this later. Right now, feeling it fully would only slow him down. They found the records room exactly where the former worker had indicated, a locked office adjoining what looked like a processing chamber. Medical equipment arranged with a clinical precision that made the room somehow worse than the cells outside it. Adora made quick work of this lock too, and Yunwoo stepped inside alone while the others held the corridor, some instinct telling him this was a moment he needed to face without an audience. The records were exactly as detailed as promised. Ledgers stacked along a single shelf, each entry marked with a name, an origin, and a brief note on circumstances of capture. Yunwoo found his brother's entry faster than he expected to, as though some part of him had known precisely where to look. Min's name, followed by a note that read simply, "Acquired through internal betrayal, asset compromised prior to extraction, terminated during retrieval attempt. Terminated during retrieval attempt." The clinical wording made something in his chest crack open in a way even his brother's raw, bleeding memories hadn't managed. His brother's death, reduced to a bureaucratic footnote in someone else's ledger, filed alongside dozens of other names that had apparently suffered the exact same fate. He didn't have time to process the weight of it fully before a voice spoke from the doorway behind him, calm, faintly amused, entirely unsurprised. "You found it faster than I expected," the voice said. "Most people who make it this far don't have the stomach to actually read what's in there." Yunwoo turned to find a man standing in the doorway, older than he expected, gray threading through dark hair, an expression of mild professional curiosity rather than any real alarm. "Will," he asked, without preamble, how a masked stranger had managed to slip past facility security without triggering a single alarm, genuine curiosity rather than fear coloring the question. Yunwoo didn't answer that. He asked his own question instead, voice steady despite everything churning beneath it. He asked whether Will remembered a man named Min, processed through this facility roughly 2 years earlier. Something flickered across Will's expression, brief calculation rather than guilt, the look of a man mentally flipping through an enormous catalog of names. He admitted, after a moment, that the name meant nothing specific to him personally, that he oversaw hundreds of cases and couldn't be expected to remember individual details without consulting the records himself. That admission, more than any confession could have, told Yunwoo everything he needed to know about the man standing in front of him. His brother's death hadn't been personal to Will at all. It had been paperwork, one entry among hundreds, processed and filed and forgotten within days. Yunwoo told him the name meant everything to him, because Min had been his younger brother, and asked whether Will intended to explain what exactly this facility processed players for, or whether he preferred Yunwoo simply find out himself by reading through every remaining ledger on that shelf. Will's calm slipped slightly at that, recalculating the situation now that personal motive had entered a conversation he'd clearly expected to remain professional. He called out, sharply, a name that confirmed Yunwoo's worst suspicion before she even appeared. Sarah stepped into the doorway a moment later, armored, weapon already drawn, eyes narrowing on the masked figure standing over Will's shoulder in the records room. She asked Will, without looking away from Yunwoo, whether this was the stranger who'd been causing problems on the lower floors. Will confirmed it, backing carefully toward the door while gesturing for her to handle the threat directly. Yunwoo watched Sarah's face as recognition slowly built behind her eyes, some flicker of memory surfacing as she studied the mask, the posture, something in his stance that apparently echoed a man she'd once known well enough to betray. He reached up and pulled the mask away before she could fully place it, wanting her to see his face clearly when he said what came next. "You knew my brother," he said quietly. "Min." Sarah's weapon lowered a fraction, shock replacing the professional focus she'd walked in with. She stared at him for a long moment, searching his features for the resemblance that had apparently just clicked into place, and something like genuine distress crossed her expression before she managed to smooth it back into practiced neutrality. She asked, voice tighter than before, what exactly he thought he knew. Yunwoo told her everything, flatly, without theatrical anger, because the memory itself carried enough weight without needing embellishment. He told her he'd watched the memory of her blade entering his brother's chest, watched the exact moment Min's trust shattered into betrayal, carried in a watch that had shown him every detail she probably assumed had died with the only witness. Sarah's composure cracked fully at that, something raw and unguarded surfacing beneath the armor and the years since. She told him, voice unsteady now, that it hadn't been simple, that Blue Sword had given her no real choice once her own position within the clan came under threat for her association with an independent party, that Min's death had been the price of her own survival rather than something she'd wanted. Yunwoo asked her whether that justification had made it easier to drive the blade home while he looked at her with an expression that held no room left for anything but understanding what she'd done to him. Sarah had no answer to that. She simply stood there, weapon still lowered, caught between the woman who had apparently convinced herself the betrayal was necessary and the one now confronted directly by its living consequence. Will, watching this exchange from near the doorway, seemed to recalculate his own priorities the moment he realized Sarah's attention had fully shifted away from defending the facility. He turned to flee down the corridor, only to find Khan blocking the exit, weapon already drawn, expression flat and unforgiving. The fight that followed was fast and brutal, Sarah's loyalty finally splitting between self-preservation and whatever remained of genuine feeling for a man she'd once claimed to love. Hesitating just long enough at the critical moment that Yunwoo's dagger found an opening her earlier reflexes would never have allowed. She went down hard, wounded rather than killed, staring up at him with an expression that held more relief than fear, as though some part of her had been waiting years for this exact reckoning. Will's fight lasted considerably less time. Khan and Doyle cornered him before he made it halfway down the corridor, and whatever authority the man carried within Blue Sword's structure evaporated entirely once actual violence replaced the careful, clinical distance he was used to operating behind. Yunwoo arrived in time to watch Khan's blade end it, quick and merciless. No ceremony attached to a death that had been owed to dozens of forgotten names on that records shelf. Sarah remained on the ground, breathing hard, watching Yunwoo approach with the dagger still in hand. She asked quietly whether he intended to finish this the same way Will's fight had ended. Yunwoo stood over her for a long moment, weighing something he hadn't fully decided until this exact instant. He told her, finally, that killing her wouldn't bring his brother back, and that some part of him suspected she'd already been living inside a punishment worse than death long before tonight, trapped by a choice she clearly hadn't stopped regretting. He left her alive, badly wounded, disarmed, with the records room's contents already being gathered by Ule for evidence that would eventually reach administrators willing to investigate Blue Sword's real operations. Whatever fate awaited Sarah now belonged to consequences beyond his own hand, and something about leaving that judgment to someone other than himself felt like the first genuinely clean decision he'd made since his brother's death. They left the facility before dawn, records secured, the immediate threat of Will's operation ended, though Blue Sword itself remained a far larger organization than one dead senior member could meaningfully cripple. Yunwoo understood that clearly enough. Tonight had closed one wound. It hadn't ended the war his brother's death had started, only proven that the war could actually be fought, and won, piece by piece, name by name. Somewhere above them, higher floors waited, holding whatever remained of the people and organizations connected to his brother's betrayal, unaware that the masked stranger who just ended Will's operation had no intention of stopping here.